Let me tell you how Title IX really got started. I was working part-time as an instructor and a visiting lecturer at the University of Maryland while I was getting my degree. They had a huge expansion, 7 openings, and they didn't even consider me. So I went to one of my male friends on the faculty, and he just looked at me and said, well, let's face it, you come on too strong for a woman.
Too strong for a woman. Title IX. No person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance.
These words represent the law that changed women's role in America forever. Prior to its implementation, women and girls lacked the freedom of opportunity in schools, both in education and athletics.
Equality had been an issue for female Americans since the advent of World War II, when women like Rosie the Riveter encouraged lonely housewives to take up their husbands' jobs as the men left for Europe.
These jobs gave many women their first glimpses into a life and career outside of the home, which didn't involve female tasks of bearing children or tidying homes.
When the war ended in 1945, veterans returned to claim their jobs and the housewife was again restricted to the home.
Many women, however, began to realize that they were not content with being only wives and mothers and began to desire careers like their male counterparts.
As American women began to work outside of the home as teachers or nurses, it became apparent that the workplace would also be divided into domestic and masculine fields.
This division was likewise reflected in the education system across the country, as girls studied home economics while their male classmates attended more rigorous courses involving math or science.
Young girls were directed towards teaching jobs if they wished to have careers at all, and were continually warned of the hazards of being too intelligent. Young boys, however, were encouraged to strive for the highest earnings, most prestigious positions as lawyers or doctors, and were even allowed to partake in upper-level classes that females could not.
Title IX was designed to end this type of discrimination that existed in schools and finally complete the circle of civil rights in America. At the time, women had achieved the right to vote and had gained certain freedoms in the workforce, but the battle toward equality had not yet been won.
Because the inequality present was perpetuated by every generation's own acceptance of the woman as a domestic animal, and existed largely because of this view, Title IX received a cultural resistance.
There was obviously issues about women in the workplace that were coming about during that time. Women in schools, in education, and then, but mainly those two. So employment and school systems or education were a couple of the two huge ones. When they kind of go cyclically. Women in education also resulted in women in the workplace, and it just became, you know, in full circle. So if we wanted women in the workplace or to be able to be in certain workplaces, we needed them to be in educational systems or to have the right to have an education.
Despite the clear nature of the law, opposition and active resistance existed, and the law was not immediately regarded, obeyed, or enforced.
The road towards complete equality in schools and their programs was a rocky one. The law faced wave after wave of opposition. The issue of equal education was thrown against the tide of culture.
Despite the opposition, on July 23rd of 1972, the Education Amendments Act, containing Title IX, was signed by President Nixon. Although it represented an important first step towards equality in education for women, the fight had only just begun.
The effects of Title IX were not immediate. It was not until 1974 that the regulations for the law were written, and they did not become a part of the law until 1975.
On top of that, there was a 6-year period of allowance for schools to reform their programs and comply with the regulations. However, the designated compliance date of 1978 came and went, and the changes still had not been made.
This was perhaps in part of the subconscious ideal of the cultural inequalities of gender that many communities still held even in the 1970s.
The Supreme Court eventually ruled that violators of Title IX were financially responsible to individuals that they took their rights away. So then, if I filed a Title IX claim, I had rights or I could receive financial payment.
It was not until 1979 that the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare published the guideline of standards that schools would have to meet in order to be considered in compliance with the law.
These guidelines finally forced schools to acknowledge Title IX or risk losing federal funding.
However, as the guidelines were advocated and schools were beginning to reform, opposition was met. Schools were reluctant to allow female students to study the hard sciences and maths and didn't want to allow co-educational classes.
There are still dramatic differences there. Your science and math, engineering, those physics, those areas are still, it's against culture. It's countercultural to have women in those.
Colleges were reluctant to allow female students to attend their schools. For a great deal of time after the passage of Title IX, females required more impressive transcripts to be admitted to the same college as a man with a less lengthy resume.
It was only with gritted teeth and clenched fists that they set the standards of acceptance equal for both men and women, and began to allow women into colleges. The biggest form of opposition came when colleges and male athletic directors realized that the law would affect not only education, but sports as well.
Today, Title IX is usually associated with sports. However, the original law made no particular reference to sports at all. From the very beginning, athletics have been a major focus of everyone concerned. Whenever the regulations of Title IX were under review, over 10,000 comments were received concerning their nature.
90% of those comments were concerning sports, whereas only 10% of the regulations that were being reviewed dealt with athletics or recreational activities in schools. Those who commented included athletic directors, coaches, parents, teachers, and many of them were in opposition.
Despite the law's original intentions to provide educational equality, the biggest culture shock was that women would be provided the same rights as men in all aspects of schools, including activities such as sports.
Though sport equality was not the intention of gender equality in schools, millions of young girls across the country were thrilled to finally be able to participate in basketball, softball, and other sports alike.
Schools were forced to abide by the regulations. With the 1979 regulation policy interpretations, a three-pronged test was offered to educational institutions. The test allowed lenience and options, providing schools with 3 different routes to take when trying to comply with the law.
The 3 prongs offered the schools to provide proportionate opportunities to male and female students, show a history and continuing practice of upgrading girls and women's programs, or meet the interests and abilities of the female students.
Many schools didn't like the 3-pronged test and wanted it done away with. They argued that they didn't have to comply with the test because it appears only in the policy interpretations and not in the regulations.
However, the schools that made such claims were usually overridden. The law was enforced by the courts and the Office for Civil Rights. Changes were going to be made whether they liked it or not.
Today, women are stronger, more independent, and ready to be successful. They hold jobs that would have been impossible prior to the passing of Title IX, proving their enthusiasm towards education.
I often say this is a man's world, this is a man's place, and it's really hard to succeed, but you've got to know when to be firm and tough, and you've got to know when to be a lady.
The amount of doctoral degrees awarded to women has increased more than 20% since 1977, and women are much more active in the fields of math, science, and others that are typically male-oriented.
Women receive 47% of bachelor's degrees in mathematics and 40% of bachelor's degrees in physical sciences.
Didn't necessarily impact a ton of legislation that we see, but how culture behaves. We see it regularly that women are in the workplace. It's not a big deal. Women are in education. My mother, on the other hand, that was not a regular occurrence. It's just a cultural thing that we have begun to see because of legislation.
Women have been rising to the challenge, and they've proven their eagerness and their ability to excel and become successful. Title IX is a living, breathing law, and there are many things that have yet to be achieved. Complete gender equality has not yet been realized. Opposition to the law still exists 30 years later. Many schools are still in compliance with the regulations, and over 20 amendments have been proposed since it was originally passed.
Despite this, the results of Title IX continue to make themselves apparent as women climb unexpectedly to powerful positions that would have been impossible to hold prior to the passing of Title IX.